Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. We've got some folks that have been back from vacation or whatever, going to see family and all that, so good to see all of you. Big thanks to Jim Weathers for filling in for me last Wednesday. We needed to go see Norma's family in Lubbock, and we had a wedding in Amarillo, and then we needed to go see my daughter and her family in northwest Kansas, and then we made it back, and it's wonderful to be back. About 1,300 miles in the car. Used to be nothing. Now it's a major pain. So anyway, that's just me. Good to be back, and thanks to Jim. Hey, we're in Habakkuk this evening. I didn't count. I don't know exactly where we are. I think we're like number 8 or 9 or something in our study of the minor prophets. So if you'll turn to the book of Habakkuk, it's right after Nahum, and we'll get started here in just a second. Nothing is really known about Habakkuk personally beyond his name. That's just about all we know of him. It's not unusual. God brings forth people in the Bible that maybe one time for a purpose and we never see them again, and so we really don't know a lot about him. I think I love to study the individuals in the Bible, but the purpose is really the things that we study and the things that individual does in the name of God or otherwise. So we don't know a whole lot about him. We think he might be a temple singer or musician. If you'll look at chapter 3 of Habakkuk, and I just turned into Zephaniah because my onion skin paper doesn't turn real well. If you turn into chapter 3, you'll see that the first verse of chapter 3 says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on, and I'll give a shot at trying to say this, Shingionoth, okay? On Shingionoth. What is Shingionoth? Well, it could be a musical term that we don't know exactly what it is. If you look at the very last verse of chapter 3 and the whole book ends with, for the director of music, on my stringed instruments. So we kind of get this when we're in the Psalms, and we know about David being a great musician and writing and the Psalms and playing the harp and all that. But once in a while we run into somebody else in some sort of a musical setting. So, and we'll get to chapter 3 after a while, but apparently chapter 3 was written for the director of music, yet it fits within the prophecy. It's a prayer, the prayer of Habakkuk. It fits within the prophecy of the entire book. So very interesting. So maybe that's the only hint that we have about Habakkuk. It's all I know anyway. Maybe you've found something else. All right. Habakkuk witnessed the Reformation under the very dynamic leadership of King Josiah, the last good king of Judah. Now, we've talked about him in weeks past. Josiah was a good guy. Remember Josiah, found and brought forth the book of Deuteronomy, the law, and he tried to change things. Josiah was the guy that tried to get rid of, and I think he was fairly successful at it, to get rid of the idols within Judah. And it's always been amazing to me that the people of God, how quickly they moved from being the nation, the people of God, reverted backwards into idol worship. And now, 400 years before they became the nation of God in the promised land, there were idols and everything. Were they worshiping them? I don't know. Were they worshiping God? I don't know. I don't know what they were doing worship-wise. But afterwards, it didn't take too long for them to kind of go back and forth. Yes, we want to love God, we want to worship God, and then they bring in the idols. And yes, we want to love God, we want to worship God, and they bring in the idols. And this rhythm kind of keeps going. And this is where we are with Josiah. We've already talked about that. But I wanted you to know that Habakkuk was there when Josiah was king. So he knew all this. In fact, he may have been one of, as I mentioned, the singers or the musicians or whatever in the temple at that time. He also watched a great world kingdom fall. And that would, of course, been Assyria. Assyria died before his very eyes. Now, for historical purposes, remember that back in 722, and remember, we're in BC, so the numbers go backwards. Okay, so we go back into 722, and we see that Assyria, after a battle or two, and the northern kingdom of Israel made Assyria mad and all that, decided to just take them out. So they did. They destroyed the northern kingdom. 10 tribes took them off into captivity. Don't know anything else about them after that. So that's what happened in Assyria. That Assyria is gone at this point. We're in Habakkuk, and there is no Assyria because Babylon has taken over, all right? So Babylon has now taken over, and we believe that Josiah has witnessed all of that. Now, Josiah also was an honest seeker of truth, and that's what this book, a lot of this book is about. He is a seeker of truth. He was willing to go directly to God for the answers to some very hard questions. So if that's all we know about Habakkuk, it's a pretty good example for us. It's okay to go to God for the hard questions. I mean, the hard ones. It's not only okay, it's something we probably ought to do. And therefore draw a closer relationship to God and maybe get the answers to these things. Now, hard questions are not relegated just to biblical times. People have hard questions today. We'll talk a little bit more about that again. And then Habakkuk was a careful student of God's dealing with his chosen people. So when doubts arose and he could not reconcile a bad world and a good God and righteous laws that God had given, he refused to dismiss his doubts without an answer. This made him an honest seeker of the truth. He asked God, why is this? Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. All right, let's get into the dating of the prophecy. Most likely it was somewhere in the area of 612 to 608 BC. If you remember from our previous study, Josiah, the 16th king of Judah, that was about 640 to 609. So if you take 640 to 609 and then look up at the very top of the PowerPoint, we believe the prophecy was 612 to 608. Well, okay, we're crossing paths with Josiah here. He instituted, of course, major religious reforms, all right? So after the fall of Assyria, which was in 616, just before Josiah took charge of Judah, before the first, the fall of Syria in that period of time, and it fell to Babylon. Now, we've got kind of three things going on here in a relatively short period of time. We have Assyria and their great empire, and this is from what today, southern Iraq, all the way up to northern Iraq, Nineveh, as we've been talking about, all the way over through the Tigris-Euphrates rivers, and then on down the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea and taking in Israel as well. The next who conquered them were the Babylonians. Okay, so the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians. And then the Chaldeans rose up. The Chaldeans were a mighty group from southern Mesopotamia, down in the southern part of what we call Iraq today. They then took over Babylon. So when the Bible talks, at this point on, when the Bible talks about Babylon, and that's the general terminology, it still is, because that's the country, but it's led by the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans took over. Did I say Chaldeans a while ago, or did I say Syria? I think I said whatever. Anyway, it was Chaldeans. And so they took over, and Chaldeans were not nice. They were bad folks. And all they could think about was war and conquer and kill and maim and gather up all the resources they could and things of this nature. So under Babylon, under the leadership of the Chaldeans now, are the ones that are ultimately going to get Judah and take Judah off into captivity as well. So that's kind of where we are. So probably his Habakkuk's prophecy was before the first deportation of Judah into Babylon. And that would have taken place in 606 BC. So why? Why all this? Well, because the rise of Babylon is coming. Chapter 1, 5 through 7, and the temple was still in existence. So there's two pieces of evidence that we know that kind of give us indication of the date that we're talking about. So chapter 2 and verse 20, apparently the temple was still in existence. All right. So open your books now, if you haven't already, to Habakkuk. Let's jump into the good book of Habakkuk. All right. Habakkuk, as we begin, first chapter all the way through the third verse of the second chapter, Habakkuk is perplexed. He is perplexed. He sees things he doesn't understand. He sees things he doesn't get how they fit into God being great and God being our ruler and God taking care of us and us being in the promised land. And things happen and he doesn't understand that. So he begins to approach God with it. Okay, so there's two different pieces of, is that right? Two pieces of perplexity with Habakkuk. And the first one begins in chapter 1 and verse 2. Habakkuk says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help?" So apparently, before we ever hear from Habakkuk, he's been talking to God. He's been praying and asking for something, asking for help. "How long must I call for help? But you do not listen." Several times we're going to stop in this because of all the prophets that we've studied, modern living today can identify with Habakkuk as much as anybody I know of. Anybody I know of. How many times have you heard people say, "Why did God let this happen? Why does a good, loving God allow all this terrible stuff to happen?" Okay, let's keep reading because we're going to get into this. But you do not listen. Okay. "Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save." Verse 3, "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounding. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails." Now, the Jewish people that were still trying to follow God, not all of them did, but the Jewish people that are still trying to follow God, they followed God via the law. And even later, during the time of Christ, you remember we have the Sadducees and the Pharisees and whatever. And the Pharisees were the folks that really focused on the law, tried to interpret it, even tried to write different things about it and everything. The law was everything to them. And it was back then too. That's how they followed God, was via the law. So Habakkuk says, again in verse 4, he says, "Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails." The law not only tells us how we ought to act and what we ought to stay away from, but the law also tells us what to do to create justice in certain situations. And I always laugh because I always use this illustration. If my cow falls in a hole in your yard, you get to keep the cow, but you have to pay me for it. That was the law, okay? Now today you might say, okay, we'll go get the cow and I get to keep it. Not in Jewish law. If the hole's in your yard, you get to keep the cow, but you have to pay for it. Those are things that guided the lives of the Israelites, of the people of God. They look to the law for everything. What do we do about this? What do we do about that? And so he says, the law doesn't work anymore. And he's crying out to God. Where does the law work? It's paralyzed, he said. So then God answers. That's a very short piece, but then God answers. He says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe. Oh no, Habakkuk's probably about to pass out now because he's already seen things that he didn't like or he didn't believe in. He says in verse 6, I'm raising up the Babylonians. Oh, please don't do that, God. Please don't raise up the Babylonians. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law unto themselves. So they don't believe in our Jewish law, or the law of Moses. They don't believe in that. Verse 8, their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like the vulture sweeping to devour. They all come bent on violence. The hordes advance like a desert wind. He just keeps on going. Habakkuk has to be completely befuddled at this point. He's calling out to God. Why are things like this? I don't get why things are like this. You're not listening to me, he says. I cry out that there's violence everywhere. Things are going bad. There's no injustice. And God starts it out by, look at the nations. I'm going to raise up Babylon. And Babylon is the worst thing that could possibly happen to Judah at this time. So when we think about our own lives, sometimes when we need God, it seems like things only get worse. How many times have you either been involved in or have dealt with individuals who use that same supposed understanding and saying, if God is a loving God, why would he send someone to hell? That's a whole different story. If God is a loving God, why would he let my mother die? If God is a loving God, why would he let these calamities happen? I'm sure right now in Florida and all the way up through the Carolinas, a lot of people are saying, why did God let this happen? This is one of the worst things, I think, that has happened to those folks in a long time. And there's no doubt there are people questioning God because of those bad things that have happened. God's answer? He says, I'm not indifferent. I'm not indifferent to this. It's not that I'm not answering your questions, Habakkuk, but here's how I'm going to answer it. I'm going to raise up Babylon to judge wicked Judah. Habakkuk wants everybody else punished, and God says, I'm going to punish you guys. I'm going to come after you. Think of how tolerant God has been since Moses brought the children out and Joshua led them across the Jordan, and supposedly they were to conquer that land and become God's people. How long has it been? A long time. And I think God, if Habakkuk has a complaint, if he has a, where are you, God? I've been calling to you and I'm not getting an answer. If Habakkuk is that way, think how frustrated God is. Do you think God could go on a tirade right here and just begin to list all the things, and of course he's talking about Judah right now because Israel, northern Israel, is already gone. How many things can he list that Judah has done against him and violated his will and violated his God and turned to other gods? Has Judah been in a position like the other, like the Canaanites were, and like the Amorites, and like some of the other folks in that area were, sacrificing their children on the molten arms of Molech? How do you think God felt about that? That was his children as much as it was yours. That's God's people. What do you think he felt about that? So God's... Sometimes we just don't get the answer we want. You ever do that when you were a kid? Dad? And Dad has a whole different answer to your request for him than you expected. How many times have you been frustrated in your walk with the Lord, or frustrated in your walk with Jesus here on earth in any way, whether it be relationships, it could be jobs, could be anything? How many times have you been frustrated with that and begged for an answer from God? I just finished listening to, and by the way, if you don't listen to Billy Wilson on Facebook, I don't know if you know Billy Wilson. He's a minister for the church in Mineral Wells, Texas now. He's a Scottish guy, so Scottish guys are always fun to listen to, except, well, never mind. If you ever listen to him, he just went through last Sunday a whole thing on when God says no, 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 no. And it was brilliant. Brilliant. We have to understand, as people living in God's kingdom today, we have to understand that God's wiser than we are. God knows more than we are. God sees everything. He knows how to deal with us better than we do. So when we ask for help, oftentimes he gives a different answer than we would like. No different than what Habakkuk was going through. Let's look at Habakkuk's second perplexity and how God answers that. And that begins in chapter 1 and verse 12. So he says, "O Lord, are you not from everlasting?" He's praising God here now. He's telling God who God is. "My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O rock," I love it how Habakkuk calls God rock. Lord is wonderful, but this is maybe the only time I know of where he or anybody calls God rock. Boy, that's a firm, solid thing. "You have ordained them to punish." Verse 13, "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil." He's beginning to get on to God a little bit here. "You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous?" I know who you are, God. You're a good God. You're a wonderful God. You're the God that can't stand things that are bad. You only like things that are loved. So I know you're not going to be able to tolerate Babylon. You're not going to do that, are you? "Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves?" Doesn't make any sense to us that if we are righteous, those who are wicked get along better than we do. We don't get that here on earth because we don't get what God's up to. We don't really get what he's doing. We don't really get what his purpose is. Verse 14, he says, "You have made men like fish in the sea." Jump down to 15. "The wicked foes pull all of them up like hooks." We're the fish, and the wicked are the fishermen. And we get caught. We get caught with a hook, and they get the spoils, and we get nothing but bad. Let's go on. He keeps going on with this fishing type thing. Let's get down into chapter 2. He says, "I will stand my watch." This is Habakkuk. "I will stand my watch and station myself at the ramparts." Those are the walls. Ramparts are the walls, or the barriers. He's going to stand on the barriers, and he's going to watch. "I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint." All right, God's going to answer now in verse 2. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it, for the revelation awaits an appointed time. Write down what I'm telling you, put it on tablets, and spread it everywhere. You're not going to be the only one that knows this. Everybody's going to know this, okay? It speaks of the end. Wow, not good news. And will not prove false. Though it lingers, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. So I'm begging God, Lord, what do you get about this? Sure, this is not you. You can't do this. You're good. You can't see all this bad stuff. I'm going to wait on the ramparts to see what you say. And God says, well, write it down and take it to all the different areas of Judah you can think of, because it's getting ready to happen. It's going to happen. I love his terminology here. He says, though it lingers, in other words, it's not happening right now. Though it lingers a little bit, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. Now, if I'm correct in that Habakkuk's prophecy, is six in the first part of the 600s there. And the first bit of takeaway of captives by Babylon was in 606. The main part happened in 587 and 86, where Babylon surrounded, conquered Jerusalem, took everybody away, and tore Jerusalem to pieces, and the temple. It was destroyed. It was gone. So that's the time period, 25, 30 years, 35 years. It's going to happen. So you wait and see what's going to happen, because I guarantee it's going to happen. All right. Now God is going to turn from telling Habakkuk about what's going to happen and the judgment coming on Judah, and Judah's going to be gone into captivity. We know the story later that Judah gets to come back, but they're going to be gone into captivity. Now he's going to turn and he's going to begin to pronounce judgment on Babylon. So chapter 2, beginning in verse 4, he says, see, this is Babylon. He's talking about Babylon now. See, he is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by his faith. Stop right there just for a second. The first thing we need to take away from this is God is saying the same thing to them that he says to us. God's message doesn't change, okay? Some of the places, some of the events and things are different, but God's message doesn't change. The righteous will live by his faith. So what do you need to do, Habakkuk? What does everybody here in Judah need to do? Don't lose your faith in God. Maintain your faith in God. Verse 5, indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never sees and never at rest, because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the people. That's Babylon. And it's not just Babylon, by the way. It's a lot of different empires. Now, what was the whole concept of this empires? We want to get as much stuff as we can. We want your resources. We want your riches. And we want your people to either come work for us or just shut up and leave us alone. Don't mess with us. And that's kind of the position that Judah was in after they came back, because they were never really themselves much after that. Behave yourself, okay? Because the empires, I'm going to let Babylon come and take you, because that's who he is. I'm going to lift him up. Does God say Babylon's the good guy? Babylon is the hero? No, he doesn't. He's going to pronounce judgment on Babylon. Okay. All right. Let's keep going on this. And beginning in verse 6, he begins the woes to Babylon. Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and and scorn them in verse 6. Woe to him, there's your first woe, who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Will not your debtors suddenly arise? They will not wake up and make you tremble. On and on and on. Look at the next woe in verse 9. Woe to him who builds his realm by unjust gain. Well, that's Babylon. That's not the way you're supposed to do it, Babylon, but that's the way they do it. Unjust gain, to set his net on high, to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples. Shame on your house and forfeiting your life. Shaming your own house and forfeiting your own life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. Another woe's coming up in verse 12. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed. Habakkuk, pay attention. I'm not on Babylon's side. I'm on your side. But you guys have been sinning against me. You guys have turned to evil. So I'm going to let these other folks take care of you. That's how God does it. Rise somebody up to take care of them. But are they the good guys? No, I've got things in store for them. Woe to him who builds a city by bloodshed and establishes a town by crime. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, and the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Another woe is found in verse 15. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, and that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with the shame instead of glory. Now it's your turn. Drink and be exposed. What's God saying? He said, whatever you've done, I'm going to turn it around and it's going to be done to you. I think today our term is what goes around comes around. And that's what's going to happen to Babylon. Look at verse 17. The violence that you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you. We're not even talking about Lebanon. God is bringing up history of Babylon that he's going to get justice for, and we're not even talking about that. And your destruction of animals will terrify you, for you have shed man's blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Wow. My goodness. Verse 19, another woe. Will it end? Let's read it. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life. What? Keep reading. Or to lifeless stones, wake up. Can you give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it. Oh, I get it now. He's talking about their idols, isn't he? Woe to you who says to wood, come to life. Now, I know in the day and age in which we live, we would look at an idol and we would say, that's crazy to think that's a god. That thing's carved out of stone, or it might be beautiful. I mean, it might be wonderful. It might be covered with gold, as he said. It might be a fabulous thing. How could the Israelites look toward that golden calf that was made from their earrings and everything? How could they look at that thinking that was a god? How? How could they do that? It's unbelievable. God has the answer. He says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. We've heard that, haven't we? Let all the earth be silent before him. The creation of God is so quick to turn against their creator in everything that they do. All right. Let's look at chapter 3 now, which is the prayer of Habakkuk. Prayer for compassion in the midst of judgment. Habakkuk cannot deny, he can't say, well, all this stuff you say is not going to happen. Well, it is. And I think he's convinced that it is. So this is the prayer that may be like David's Psalms. It may be meant as a musical thing. May just be in poetry. I'm not smart enough to know the difference here. Okay, let's go. Habakkuk's prayer. The very first verse tells us again that this is a Shigionoth, okay, so whatever that is. Verse 2, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. So he's asking God, praying to God for mercy. Verses 3 through verse 7, he talks about God's past work, all the things that God has done in the past. He's done wonderful things, okay? In verse 8, I'm saying this because we're running out of time. 8 through 12, there are questions again by Habakkuk. He says, were you angry with the rivers, O Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode with your horses and your victorious chariots? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth like rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. I think that was a reference to the flood, okay? Jump down, keep going. He's talking to God here. Look at verse 13. In verse 13, he says, you came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot with his own spear and pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour. So he goes on and in verse 13, in verse 13, hang on a second. Let me jump down to verse 20. In verse 20, we have a picture of Habakkuk and God. And in verse 16 and 17, he says, I heard, my heart pounded, my lips quivered, at the sound of decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity. Has Habakkuk changed his mind already? I wait for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Verse 17, though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crops fail and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. What kind of a transition has Habakkuk made here? I think God put fear in him because God said, I'm going to take this nation out. I'm going to raise up Babylon and I'm going to take them out, okay? The sovereign Lord is my strength, verse 19. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on to the heights. For the director of music on my stringed instruments. So Habakkuk did kind of come around, didn't he? Maybe if we have a conversation like that with God, maybe we will come around in our time of questioning. And by the way, God doesn't say it's wrong to question. God doesn't say it's wrong to ask. God doesn't say it's wrong to go to him in prayer and make your request known. It is good. It is a good thing. All right, takeaways for us real quick. God can and will judge his people when they become wicked. The wicked, even though used by God to judge someone else, are still responsible to God for their own wickedness. Number 3, prayer in the time of judgment and crisis is the right approach by penitent people of God. Hey guys, next week. Don't forget the devotional across the street. God bless. Dr. Garrison. How are you, sir? No, it was very good.